Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, my name is Angel and today we are doing some thrift store makeovers. For this first project, I grabbed this little wood canvas from my thrift store for about 50 cents, but you can definitely buy these at Dollar Tree or a craft store. I'm also going to be using one of these thin little wood planks that I got from Dollar Tree, but the first thing I wanted to do was stain the frame of this. Now, I mixed up some brown paint that I liked and just watered down my paintbrush. I wasn't concerned about the paint getting onto the center because I am going to cover that, but I also use that same paint color to stain that little rectangle plank. And as you can see, after I stained them, then I just wiped off the excess with a paper towel. Now, like I said, I am going to cover the center of that frame, so I'm using some of this vintage scrapbook paper that I have, and I just used a glue stick and put that glue stick all over the back of it, and then laid it in my frame and smoothed it out. I also ended up using this little Cricut tool just to make sure all the corners were nice and flat against the frame. For that little thin wood piece, I'm going to be using this rub-on transfer that I got from Dollar Tree, and I'm just going to be using the part that says flowers, seeds, blooms, and stems, I think it said, but I'm just going to rub that onto here, and then here I'm just figuring out where the center is. I'm actually going to glue this to the right side of the frame so it kind of looks like part of the frame coming out, and then I just used some wood glue and again used my ruler to make sure it was in the center. For this next project, I picked up this vintage Perpetual Calendar from my thrift store, and it had all its pieces with it, which is very rare for me to find, if I find these at all, so I definitely wanted to pick this up and make it over. Now, I'm not sure what was at the top of this before. I think it was a clock, but it did have 3 screw holes, so I went ahead and filled those in with some wood filler. I let the wood filler dry for a few hours and then sanded this down. I decided to use the color plaster in my Waverly chalk paint on this, and I don't know if I've ever really mentioned this, but I do keep a little spray bottle of water near my crafting stuff so that when I'm using chalk paint, I can spray my project down first, and it just helps the chalk paint glide more smoothly, and you also don't have to use as much of the chalk paint because it makes it a little thinner. For this piece, I ended up doing just 2 coats of the plaster chalk paint. Now, since this is a calendar, I of course wanted to make this interchangeable for seasons and holidays up here at the top. So I found this little square frame at the thrift store, and I thought this would fit perfectly up here. And then I'm also going to be using 2 of these little wood planks from Dollar Tree, and I'm just going to make these interchangeable, like I said, for different holidays and seasons. Now, these little wood planks were just a little big for my frame, so I did end up using my miter box saw to cut these down so that they would fit. I sanded both pieces down after I cut them, and then again I'm just using a wet paint brush with some of my brown paint to stain both of these. Once they were dry, I'm going to be using some of my clear stamps to make the front and back sides of these. One for spring and summer, one for fall, Halloween, and one for Christmas. But I'm also realizing now that I completely forgot about Easter, so I will probably make a few more of these. But to make this frame so that I can change those in and out and flip them over, I'm using some of these little velvet Velcro tabs that I got from Dollar Tree. And even though they do have the sticky backing, I'm using some gel super glue to attach the first little pieces to the frame just to make sure that they do stay on, because the adhesive on the back of these isn't the best, but you definitely want to make sure that you let this glue dry completely before attaching the other side to this. Now, once it is completely dry and I don't have to worry that these two pieces are going to get glued together, then I'm going to attach the opposite side onto here, and I'm going to add just a small tiny little dot of super glue to the center of these, and then flip this over and attach it to the calendar. Again, you'll want to let that glue dry completely before taking this on and off of here. Then all I had to do was just add my little months and my days back onto here. And for the days of the week, I could actually still see a small little imprint of the days of the week that was on here before I painted it. So I just kind of used those letters and went back over it with one of my black markers. For this project, I picked up this frame that kind of has this beveled edge to it, and I thought it would be perfect to make a tray. Now, to make the bottom of this tray, I'm going to be using 7 of these thin Dollar Tree wood planks, and unfortunately, these were just a tiny bit too big to fit down in this frame, so I did end up having to cut about an inch off of each one of these pieces. Then I decided to just paint my frame with some of my white chalk paint, and this took about 2 to 3 coats to finish. And for the wood planks, I decided to just stain these, so I'm using some brown acrylic paint with a wet rag to do that. And then once those were dry, I'm taking what was left over on my paintbrush from painting my frame, and I'm just dry brushing a little bit of white over these to make it look more weathered and old. Then I lined up all of my pieces down in my frame as evenly as I could, then used some wood glue to put these all down on the bottom side of the frame. I also decided to embellish the frame with some of these brass corner pieces, so I just used some gel super glue to put those on there. And finally, for this tray, I wanted to add a little bit of pretty detail on it. So I'm using this little vine stencil that I got from Amazon and some of my white chalk paint and putting this right in the center. I always grab books at my thrift store, especially if they are really pretty. This one happens to be a Reader's Digest book, and I just thought that the pages were really pretty and it was thick enough for me to make a vase with. If these colors would have gone with the rest of my decor, I definitely would have left this book the way it was because it was a pretty design. But unfortunately, since I have so much green in my house, I can't have blue in here because it just clashes too much. So I'm going to cover this with some of my green and white floral scrapbook paper. The first thing I needed to do was remove all the pages from the book very carefully because we are going to be putting these pages right back into this book once I cover it. Now, if you find a book that is already pretty and fits your style, you can definitely skip this step. Now, I'm just going to be covering that front part and back part and leaving the spine of the book because I will end up painting that later, which I probably should have done before I covered it with the scrapbook paper. But here I am just kind of measuring out where I need to cut the paper, and then I'll use my paper cutter to cut those pieces down. Then I'm going to use a light even layer of Mod Podge on the front and the back side of this to put those papers onto this book. I also left a little bit hanging over the edges so that I could fold those over. Then I just used some more Mod Podge to make sure those were nice and clean. And it was at this point that I decided to paint that spine of the book, and I just used some Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to do that. Like I said, I probably should have done this before I put the scrapbook paper on, and I did try to be very careful and not get a ton on the scrapbook paper, but I wasn't too concerned because I am going to cover that. While I'm letting the spine dry, I am going to start working on the book pages. Again, I wanted to make this into a vase, so I'm actually using a box cutter. You could use an X-Acto knife for this too, but I'm kind of just cutting out a long rectangle through a few sheets in the middle. I just kind of pulled out the sheets that I wanted to do, and you can see I put a little piece of paper there to know where to stop doing it, but I just kept going through and cutting out the pages. Now with this box cutter or an X-Acto knife, you can do quite a few sheets at once, so it really goes by pretty quickly, but I just kept doing it until I was happy with the size of the hole that's going to be in the center of this. And as you can see, it's not perfect, but it doesn't matter because we're going to be putting flowers in this anyway. Now, after I finished cutting my little rectangles in the pages, I went through, I didn't do every sheet, just every few sheets with a glue stick and glued those pages together. Again, you don't have to do every sheet, just make sure that you're doing at least every 5 or 6 sheets and pressing those and making sure they're all nicely glued together. Then I closed that book up really nice and tight, and I'm gonna just use some basic school glue and go around all the edges, the sides, the top, and the bottom with a paintbrush and that school glue. And then I'm gonna clamp this book together to let that dry. Once all that glue has dried, then I'm going to take some super glue and I'm going to glue this book back into the cover. And since this is a vase and we're not going to want it to open anymore, I'm going to glue that front cover to the first page and the back cover to the back page. Then I'm going to cover up any of the paint that got to the scrapbook paper, but also give this a little more detail with some of my air dry clay and one of my clay molds. I'm just making this long decorative piece, and I'm gonna attach one piece to the front of my book and one piece to the back. And again, that's just gonna hide any paint that got onto the scrapbook paper, but also just make this a little more decorative. Then finally, I thought my book needed a title, so I'm using this rub-on transfer from Dollar Tree that just says Wildflower. And that is going to be it for today's video. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.